Good morning and welcome to our Bible study this morning. We're so glad to see all that have come out to study. We have some visitors with us again today, and we're happy that you can be here. We'll be looking in 1 Samuel chapter 20 this morning. If you'd like to open your Bibles there as we continue our study of the United Kingdom and our, I like to call it a trek through the Bible, four-year trek through the Bible. This is an interesting section, but all the sections are interesting, I think. But we're looking at the waning part of Saul's reign as he really begins to turn against the Lord's anointed and do a whole lot of things that are displeasing to God, and tries to kill David as the one who's already been anointed as God's king. But in this morning's lesson, we'll be looking at 1 Samuel chapters 20 and 21. And a couple of psalms that were written in view of this period of history as well, psalms written by David. We'll be looking at Jonathan's loyalty to David as the Lord's anointed in 1 Samuel 20. Then David and the holy bread as it's found in 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 9. And then David fleeing to Gath to escape Saul's assassination, attempt. And then we'll be looking at Psalm 34 and Psalm 56 briefly, noticing some things that David wrote there relative to this time period, and things I think that will really help us in dealing with tribulation and trials and difficulties in our lives, as well as so many of David's Psalms do. Well, we'll pick up then in 1 Samuel 20, looking at Jonathan's loyalty to David. You might remember as we were studying Wednesday night that David was in Ramah and Naioth with Samuel. And so he flees from there and goes to Jonathan. And that's probably in the vicinity of Gibeah, although that's never exactly said, just because of the events that transpire and Jonathan's proximity to that. But not sure exactly where that is that he's gone to, but he finds Jonathan. And he asks Jonathan, "What have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father that he seeks my life?" So David goes to Jonathan and asks him, what is your father got against me that he's trying to kill me? And basically Jonathan responds to that by saying, "Hey, my dad's not trying to kill you. If my dad were trying to kill you, he'd tell me. He tells me everything. He wouldn't do anything without telling me first." So that's Jonathan's basic response to what Saul says. But David is certain that that Saul is indeed going to kill him, intending to kill him, I should say. And the only reason Jonathan doesn't know about it is that Saul is sparing Jonathan's feelings. He doesn't want Jonathan to know because he knows David and Jonathan are friends. So David says in verse 3, he took an oath again, and he said, "Your father certainly knows that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is but a step between me and death.'" That's such a poignant statement by David, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you just knew death. You ever had a brush with death, as we call it? It's just like something happened, an accident or something like that, and you could have just as easily died as lived. And David sees that coming. He is just that close to death. It's a brush with death. There's just a step between me and death. Just any time it could happen because of Saul's determination to get rid of David, as of course he's jealous of him and sees him as a rival to his throne and to his kingdom. So Jonathan agrees and David agree together to try to just ascertain what Saul's true intentions are, and they're going to do that by gauging Saul's reaction to David's absence at a feast of the new moon. You pick up that and find that out in verse 4. Jonathan says, "Whatever you do, you say I'll do," and David says, "Well, tomorrow's going to be the new moon, and I should be there." The new moon, as you might remember, was a monthly feast. It was part of the Mosaic law, David would have had an expectation from Saul that he would be at this monthly feast, this new moon feast. Numbers chapter 10, Numbers chapter 28. We studied this just not too long ago here, going through that section of Scripture. That's where this is set up. But there was supposed to be a blowing of trumpets, a celebration every new moon. And I think that apparently people in Israel had turned that probably into a little bit more than God intended. Sounds like it's at least a 2-day feast. But nonetheless, that's what was going on. And it's even mentioned in the Psalms, Psalm 81 and verse 3. But in any case, it was customary, obviously then, for Saul to have a new moon feast that would last a couple of days, and all of his court and his mighty men probably were supposed to be there to enjoy that with him and honor his court. So that's what's expected of David. David knows that if he's not there, Saul will notice. And he says in verse 6, if your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked permission of me that he might run over to Bethlehem, his city. There's a yearly sacrifice there for all his family. So David, as is common during this time of his life, he makes up stories that are sometimes not true to get out of situations where his life is threatened. He tells lies, just frankly, at times. And this is a situation where he's going to have Jonathan tell something that's not true, deceive Saul in essence, but all of this to gauge Saul's reaction. Now, I might say that as we go through these scriptures, a lot of people, and I think when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people, look at David's actions here. We might remember that Michal, his wife, deceived Saul or Saul's soldiers in the previous lesson. But people look at David's actions here, other things that the people of God do along the way, and they think that just because the writer of the text doesn't stop right there and say that was a lie and David shouldn't have done that, that therefore it's okay to do that. That's not the case. People of God sin throughout the biblical text, and sometimes it's pointed out and sometimes it's not. But plainly, we have to be able to identify what an untruth is, what a lie is, purposely told, and that's displeasing to God. I'm not going to say much more about that now, but we'll try to get back to it at the end of the lesson. In any case, he tells Jonathan to say that, and so Jonathan then agrees to this. David asks Jonathan to deal kindly with him based on their covenant before the Lord. In other words, Jonathan, if I'm not what I ought to be, if you think Saul ought to kill me, why don't you just go ahead and kill me now? He literally says that in verses 8 through 10. But if because of our covenant, because of our friendship, you think that this is worth doing, then let's follow through it. And Jonathan assures David that he will indeed inform him of Saul's intention. He'll go to the feast, they'll figure this out. And so David says, well, who's going to tell me if your father answers roughly? Who's going to inform me of what you find out? And so they come up with a plan, and with God as witness, Jonathan and David make what we might call the covenant in the field. Jonathan says in verse 11, come, let's go out to the field. So both of them went out in the field, and Jonathan said to David, the Lord God of Israel is witness. In other words, we're making this agreement before the Lord. When I have sounded out my father, sometime tomorrow, the third day, and indeed there is good toward David, and I do not send to you and tell you, may the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. In other words, if I find out that my father's not going to hurt you and I don't tell you, the Lord ought to kill me. So I'm going to definitely tell you. He's making a promise before God about that. But he says, if it pleases my father to do you evil, then I will report it to you and send you away that you may go in safety. So Jonathan, before the Lord, is making this promise. The Lord be with you, as he's been with my father. You shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, But you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. Please notice what's going on here. The covenant, the two-part covenant, a covenant's an agreement between parties. The two parts of the covenant are, Jonathan's going to warn David, potentially save his life. David is going to save the lives of Jonathan's household. This is a covenant between the two, not only the two of them, but their households. Notice Jonathan's language there, making the covenant with the house of David. Now that becomes the official name of the dynasty of David when he becomes king. So he's making a covenant with the dynasty of David. Now, I said in a sermon a couple of weeks ago on this point, I think it indicates that Jonathan is aware that David is the Lord's anointed and that he is to be the next king according to the Lord. I think that's why, big reason why Jonathan's allegiance is toward Jonathan. Jonathan, you think, well, he's turning his back on his father. No, he's turning his face to the Lord is what he's doing. And he wants to support the Lord's anointed. Regardless of what his father's going to do, one way or the other, he's going to support the Lord's anointed. And this covenant is between really him and David, but also between his house and the house of David. So that's the language that's used there. Jonathan loved David. He made this covenant with the house of David and caused David to vow it as well, caused David to enter into it. So they also, before they part, after making, again, what I'm calling the covenant in the field, they make arrangements for what Jonathan is to do and what David is to do the next couple of days as Jonathan tries to figure out what Saul's intention is. So Jonathan says to David, tomorrow's the new moon. You're going to be missed. Your place will be empty. I read an article a long time ago in a church bulletin about this, based on this statement, I should say, about church attendance. When your seat is empty, you'll be missed. When your seat is empty, you'll be missed. When your seat is empty, you'll be missed. And we don't want to miss you. But that's a interesting statement. You're not going to be there. Well, there's going to be a hole. That's Tracy sometimes uses that language. There's holes, where people should be. There's holes, and you need to look around and see who's not there, and miss them, and express your concern or see if you can help in some way, if it's needed. In any case, you're going to be missed, and Jonathan says, when I find out my father's intentions, I'm going to come back and I'll have a lad with me. I'll bring my bow and arrow, and I'll shoot arrows into the field, and I'll send the lad after them. If I say to the lad, if I shout out to him, no, isn't the arrow on this side of you? Then that means everything's safe, and in other words, you can come on in if it's on this side. If I say to the lad, no, it's the arrow's on the other side, isn't the arrow further, then that's saying, David, you need to go. And so David can hide in the field and witness this and know just from that what Saul's intention would be. So a lot of intrigue. This would make a good movie, I think. A lot of planning and David fearing for his life and ready to run for his life. But right now they're just trying to figure out what the deal is with Saul. So Saul, as the feast unfolds, of course, will disclose his intentions. On the first day of the feast, sure enough, Saul notices David's not there. So he thinks, well, there's got to be some reason. Surely he's unclean. Surely there's some uncleanness, and so he's not allowed to come in with the rest of us to eat. And so something has happened along that line where David is ceremonially unclean. And so surely that's it. But then the second day, he's not there again, and Saul is suspicious, I suppose, and he inquires why David is absent. And so Jonathan uses the made-up excuse that David told him to use, that David's gone to be with his brothers in Bethlehem to a feast, to a family feast, a sacrifice there, rather, in Bethlehem. Well, that's the point where, as somebody once said, the spam hits the fan, and Saul becomes enraged. His anger is aroused here against his own son. And you see in this reaction that Saul has, don't you? You see what a terrible thing envy is, how powerful a wicked emotion that is. And Saul is so envious of David, jealous of the fact that he was lauded and praised more than he was, and that he will take over the kingdom and all of that. He's afraid of losing the kingdom. He's jealous that the Lord is with David and no longer with him, all of that. But Saul is just boiling over at this point with hatred for David. And he says in this context some truly horrible things to Jonathan. Verse 30. Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan. He said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Now, that comes out pretty politely in our English translation. Let's just say it wasn't a polite thing to say. Okay? Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? That also sounds really polite, but is not a polite thing to say at all. So he's basically using what is, in modern terms, a pretty common slur of somebody's parentage to insult Jonathan, and doubly so. The idea of the shame of your mother's nakedness, there's a couple of ideas that scholars have there, and I'm not sure exactly where that goes. I'm not going to talk about it in a mixed audience either, but in either case, something very, very shameful. Okay? Very, very shameful. So you see Saul so enraged that he's saying these very ugly things to his son Jonathan. And he says to him in verse 31, something that is the truth: as long as the son of Jesse is on the earth, you shall not be established in your kingdom. Well, it's not his kingdom anyway. It's the Lord's kingdom to give, and he's already given it to David. But Saul is thinking, well, why doesn't Jonathan, fight for his? He's the prince. He should be, attain the crown after me. So he says to Jonathan, "Send and bring him to me," that is, send and bring David to me, for he shall surely die. Jonathan, I think, tries a little bit to reason with Saul here. And he asks him, what has David done? The very question that David asked him, what have I done? What has David done that he deserves death? That's a legitimate question. David hadn't really done anything. He'd done nothing but serve Saul faithfully. And yet Saul is so enraged. You often can't reason with angry people. I don't know if you noticed that, but it's pretty hard to reason with somebody who's angry. Saul again hurls his spear, and now he's hurled it already at David multiple times, but now he takes his spear, which must have been by him, and just throws it at his own son, Jonathan. And you can only imagine what would have happened had the spear struck Jonathan and he killed him on that occasion. I have no doubt that would have changed all of Saul's demeanor, the whole story. But Jonathan is not harmed, and he leaves. He's angry and he's upset, but he's grieving. The text tells us he's grieving for David. He sees how unfairly his father is treating David. He's not at all defending his father. He's angry. He's upset, but he's grieving for David. And that brings us back to Jonathan and David meeting again in the field. So as we pick up the account in verse 35, in the morning, Jonathan returns with a lad whom he instructs to find the arrows that he shoots, just as they had planned. And per their prearranged signal, then Jonathan lets David know, just as he said he would, that Saul wants him dead. The boy comes back with the arrows, and Jonathan gives him his weapons and sends him back to the city. And then with nobody else in the field, David comes out from hiding and actually falls to the ground and bows before Jonathan 3 times. And they come and they meet and they kiss and they weep together. And the text tells us that David was weeping the most. And I don't think David's weeping because he realizes his life is in danger, but because of how the relationship between he and Jonathan has been strained here. And he sees the choice that Jonathan is making and the awfulness of everything that's going on, but the great love and faithfulness that Jonathan has for him. And it kind of is overwhelming once you start thinking about it. In verse 41, I'll just read this. As soon as the lad had gone, David arose from the place toward the south, fell on his face to the ground, and bowed down 3 times. They kissed one another, and they wept together, and David more so. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, as we have both sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, may the Lord be between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." So he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. It's a sad parting. Jonathan has responsibilities that he's going to take care of, and David is going to have to be running for his life for some time now. And yet they depart in this way. You just have to admire, don't you, the choice of Jonathan here. I think he's such a person of sterling character and just going to do the right thing and the right thing by the Lord, no matter what it costs him with respect to his own status as a prince, possible future king, his relationship with his father in the court of his father, the king. All of that is not significant to Jonathan in light of what the Lord wants. And that's got to be the way it is with us as well. As we go on in this section, we'll go to chapter 21, and not much on geography today. David is going to go to Nob, where the priests are, and then he's going to go to Gath, which is a Philistine city, and actually was the city of which famous person was from Gath? Goliath. Goliath from Gath. Okay, and I'll show you a picture of Gath here in a little bit maybe. But in chapter 21, David flees first of all to Nob and goes to Elimelech the priest. Elimelech greets David kind of warily because David's alone. Why are you, hi David, why are you by yourself? And David says, well, Saul sent me on a secret mission. Again, he's kind of fudging a story there. And David says, Saul sent me on a secret mission, and I don't have anybody with me because I've sent my men elsewhere, which apparently was part of the case. But David asked for loaves of bread for he and his men, at least 5 loaves, he says. And Ahimelech says, well, all we have is the bread, that's the showbread, and it's being changed out, essentially. This is for those in the class, when we studied quarter before last, all of the tabernacle, the showbread was set out weekly by the priest. It was to be eaten only by the priest. It was holy bread. All of that is detailed in Leviticus chapter 24. So here the priests are. Apparently the tabernacle, or at least part of its services, were being taken care of there, I gather, at this particular time. But in any case, that's all they have. Well, David, in thinking about that, Ahimelech says to David, I'll give it to you, emergency situation here, but at least if your men are not unclean, if they don't have some ceremonial uncleanness. David tells Ahimelech that, well, his men are clean, and he rationalizes that the bread is in effect common, even though it had just been replaced that day, which that was not accurate. It was not common. It was only to be eaten by the priests even after it was taken off. So that's a bit of a rationalization. I think he's saying it's going to be eaten anyway, so why not? In any case, Ahimelech gives David the bread. Most of you know this comes up in the New Testament when, on one occasion, Jesus' disciples were passing through a field and plucking the heads of grain and eating them as they go, and the Pharisees found fault with that and said they were working on the Sabbath. And Jesus has a long discussion with them about that, and we might get to talk about that some more in a little bit. But in essence, Jesus uses this as an example of a time when somebody did something that was technically against the law of God. And I think his point is not to justify David, but more to point out that the Pharisees were pretty big hypocrites because they wouldn't condemn David here, but they condemn Jesus' disciples for just plucking grain as they walked through a field, which was not a violation of the law, which was not working on the Sabbath. David appears to have violated the law here. None of them were condemning David. So I think really that's the logic to follow in that case. What Jesus is not saying is it's okay to break the law anytime you want to. That's not what he's saying. A lot of people think that's what he's saying there, but that's not the point. In passing, it's noted here in verse 7 that there's a fellow Doeg, an Edomite, an ally of Saul, who witnesses all of this. That's going to come out in the next chapter when he tells Saul what Ahimelech has done in giving David refuge, in essence, and sending him on his way with the weapon, because the next thing David does is ask for a sword, and Ahimelech says, well, we don't really have any swords here except for the one of Goliath that happens to be stored here. And David says, well, can I have that one? There's none like it. You might remember David had used that sword one time to cut off the head of Goliath. So there it is, and so he's given Goliath's sword that's stored there. So he's given food and weapons by Ahimelech. And I'll just, spoiler alert, Saul's not going to be happy with Ahimelech. That's not something that he's going to be happy to hear about. But David then goes on from there and goes to Gath, as we mentioned, as we end up in chapter 21. In verse 10, David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. Achish is the king of Gath. Gath is one of the major, or is it at least a Philistine city. David is thinking he'll be able to just slip in to Gath and be unnoticed and maybe make his way even to Achish's court and maybe find free food and a part-time job or something. I don't know what he's thinking. But anyways, he's actually captured by the Philistines. And they recognize, Achish's servants recognize him. You have in verse 11, the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, crying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s'?" David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. Take note of that. He's afraid, and with good reason. So he pretends to be crazy. he starts, scratching at the door and drooling and just slobbering all over the place, I guess, and just acting crazy. And so Achish basically says, well, I've got enough crazy people. I don't need another crazy man. I don't want him in my house. He says precisely, do I lack madmen that you brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And so David is rescued by, as we would say today, playing the fool. And Achish doesn't want him and kicks him out of town. All of that, I'm sure, in the plan of God. There's an aerial view of Gath. It was taken by my friend Leon Malden a couple of years ago. The mounds there, I think, are areas that there's some excavation being done. Probably the ancient city of Gath is under some of that. Some excavation has been done, which I read a little bit about. I see they found part of a gate, I believe, in other parts of the city. But it's a beautiful area still. This is the lower Shephelah area of Israel, hills and valleys all through here. And it wasn't far from here that the Philistines and the Israelites fought when David killed Goliath. So this is the area where David was. A couple of psalms are written during this time period, or at least relating to this time period. The first of them that I want to look at is Psalm 56. You might turn over there. We won't have time to look at all of it. But a few points about it. The heading to this psalm, which, as I mentioned Wednesday night, these headings are in the oldest manuscripts that we have. This is to the chief musician, set to the silent dove in distant lands. I don't know what tune that was. That was the tune that this was played to, but that's quite descriptive of David, the silent dove in distant lands. You just get this feeling of a lone wanderer, which is exactly what David was. So the words, no doubt, went with the tune. But it's called a miktam of David when the Philistines captured him in Gath. Some of the verses, just notice, Psalm 56, verse 3, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. Well, he was certainly afraid, wasn't he? Feared for his life, but he learned through this, whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. I will praise his word. In God I have put my trust. I will not fear. What can flesh do to me? Please notice the seeming contradiction. Whenever I am afraid, I will trust in you. I will not fear. So you have to be afraid first to have courage, right? You have to have a sense of there's something to be feared here to have the courage of faith. And you turn that over to God. And so God helped him through this, I think is what he's saying. In verse 8, there's a beautiful verse about God's care for us when we're in difficult circumstances. You number my wanderings. You put my tears into your bottle. Are they not in your book? God knows our grief. He knows our fears. He knows what we're facing all the time. And he collects all of that. He's aware of all of that. And then he says again in verse 11, in God I have put my trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? So David is, in these experiences, he's having faith, but he's also gaining faith. Right? Isn't that true of us? Go through an experience in faith, and then you come out on the other side of it, and you have more faith. I think David is learning to trust God in difficult times. He's learning to do that. We learn to trust God by trusting him in difficult times. And then you have also written about this time period, Psalm 34. Taste and see that the Lord is good. This psalm, a psalm of David when he pretended madness before Abimelech, who drove him away, and he departed. Should be Ahimelech, I think. David says, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. O magnify the Lord with me. Let us exalt his name together. The angel of the Lord encamps all around those who fear him and delivers them. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. So again, David is learning, and his faith is growing through these experiences. What comes out of his experience here, having to pretend to be mad before this Philistine king in order to spare his life, what David understands is that God deserves praise for seeing him through this. There are a lot of ways to look at bad things that happen in your life, even when you make it through them. There are a lot of different ways to think about those things. But what David does, it's a wonderful trait of faithful people, that they're able to praise God no matter what has happened. No matter what. If God has seen you through something, don't look back on that difficulty and just, a lot of people, they want to relive the bad thing that happened and let it affect them negatively, emotionally, and just go over and over that and can't seem to get past it. But I think David is able to get past it and praise God. I think that's the key to getting past bad things that have happened to us. To praise God for seeing us through. These are the parts in life where God carries us. 3 applications to think about for today's lessons, or from today's lesson, maybe I should say. First of all, choose to support whom and what the Lord supports, whether your family does or not. You see this in Jonathan. It's a great, great lesson. Jesus says, my family are those that do the will of God. He's going to support those that do the will of God. In Matthew 10 and verse 37, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Support Jesus and his cause, no matter what friends and family do or say. Second point that we did make going through, and just to clarify that lying is a sin. It's an abomination to the Lord. Lies or other sins are not justified just because they're committed by God's people in Scripture's historical narrative. Okay, we need to be aware of that. Lying is an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 6. He hates lying. Ephesians 4:25 in the New Testament, we're to put away all lying. And also in Revelation, of course, all liars will have their part in the lake of fire and brimstone. And lastly, God desires mercy and not sacrifice. This is the text in Matthew 12, where I was talking about a minute ago, where Jesus' disciples had gone through the field plucking the grain and the Pharisees found fault. Jesus tells them that God desires mercy and not sacrifice, which is to say, you might think about being kind to people, being considerate of what people are going through, before you just judge them and go on about your worship. All right. I did more talking today than usual, amazing as that is, because I have a cold and it's really bothering me to talk. But I hope it's not bothering you as much as it is me. Does anybody have anything you'd like to add at this point? Observation or anything? All right. Well, thank you for your good attention. We'll pick up there. Lord willing, I'll be away Wednesday night, but Tim will pick up there going to chapter 22.